talk to me about this new guidance that you have and what the effect is going to be.
Right. What we announced this week, and thanks for having me this morning. What we announced this week is a series of new guidance documents that we're going to be issuing that we think are going to lay out a more efficient pathway for drug developers to bring medications to market that treat pain but don't have all the addictive features of opioids. So previously we had guidance laid out in a document that we had issued in 2014. Our view is that document's outdated and also laid out a pathway to market that we think was maybe too burdensome, and it discouraged investment and development in new pain innovation. And so these new guidance documents, the goal here is to be more focused and allow drug developers to develop drugs for specific kinds of pain. Also, we're going to allow them to seek indications for opioid sparing. So if you can demonstrate that your pain drug helps spare the use of opioids, you can also get approval on the basis of that claim.
Interesting. It is a very complex issue, however, even in that opioid use might be slowing a little bit, but then the drugs that you use to get off opioids is actually picking up. So how do you measure success for something like this? What are your metrics?
Well, it's a great question, and this is becoming a very hard epidemic because it's evolving. So we actually see prescribing going down of opioids in the medical setting. RX prescribing, prescription drug use of opioids is going down. But at the same time, we see the use of illicit drugs, particularly fentanyl, going up, and it's extremely potent. If you look at the amount of seizures that Customs and Border Protection did of fentanyl coming into the United States, some of it across the border, a lot of it through the international mail facilities, that's grown at a bigger proportion than the decline in prescribing. So the concern is that even as we bring down prescribing in the medical setting and reduce overall rates of new addiction, people who become medically addicted from drugs that they get in the medical setting, more people are transitioning onto or starting on the illicit drugs. And so we've really stepped up our enforcement work in the international mail facilities with the Postal Service and Customs and Border Protection to try to interdict more drugs. But there is a very brisk flow of drugs coming to this country as this opioid crisis evolves.
So same question, then, what are the metrics? Is it going to be in prescription? Is it going to be in the amount of drugs you're able to confiscate, say, at the border? How do you measure success?
Well, I think ultimately we're going to measure success by looking at what's happening to people, what's happening to patients. Are overdose deaths going down? Are fewer people showing up in ERs with overdoses? And we can measure addiction. Are fewer people addicted to opioids? What we're looking at in the near term is morphine equivalents. And so that's how you measure basically how much opioid you're delivering. And we're looking at morphine equivalents in both prescription, so how much opioids are ultimately being consumed by the population. That's going down from prescription drugs. But we're also looking at morphine equivalents in terms of seizures. We've just completed a big operation with Customs and Border Protection. We'll be announcing the results of that soon, where we actually looked at what was coming into the international mail facilities to get a more accurate picture of exactly what is coming in, a representative sample of how many illegal, illicit opioids, fentanyl, other things are coming in through those facilities. That's going to give us a good indication of the magnitude of the problem that we're facing.
Good detail there. And this is sort of one part of what the FDA has been doing. The other is a much broader part on just simplifying how drugs get approved. How do you prioritize your first-time generic approval versus complex generics? And what's going to be a formula for you?
Well, we do prioritize first-in-class generic approvals, and we're also prioritizing now generic approvals until we have 3 drugs within a category, because what we've seen is that the big price reductions for consumers when it comes to generic drugs happens after you get that 3rd drug in the category. That's where you really have brisk competition. So we're prioritizing approvals until we see 3 drugs in every category. With respect to the complex drugs, like the EpiPen generic drug approval that we had several weeks ago, we're prioritizing trying to give more guidance to industry, to generic manufacturers, on how they can develop generic copies of those what we call hard-to-copy drugs. A complex drug is harder to copy, so we've committed to give additional guidance to manufacturers. We're also going to be releasing more information about when generic companies are trying to bust patents, if you will, of branded companies when they file so-called Paragraph 4 certifications with the agency. So we're going to be disclosing how many of those certifications we've got, whether or not a drug has been approved, whether or not one of the manufacturers has qualified for what we call 180-day exclusivity. And the goal of disclosing this information is to create a more competitive marketplace for the generic manufacturers so they can place their bets more efficiently about where they're going to be seeking to challenge patents.
Well, and obviously the hope is that you're going to have a lot more innovation competition, a lot more R&D, and a lot more drugs come to market. That brings down drug prices.
Right.
On the flip side, though, companies are going to need high drug prices to have that money to go into R&D to make those drugs. If you attack drug pricing, how does that trickle down into perhaps capping R&D?
Well, we're not looking to attack drug pricing. What we're looking to do is create more competition in the marketplace.
But you want to bring it down. But Scott, you want to bring it down at the end of the day. That's the goal.
I want to bring. You have price competition. You have product competition. My job is product competition. After lawful patents have lapsed on branded drugs, they should be subject to generic competition. I want to make sure that generic competition could come into the market. That's what Congress intended. On the flip side of that, when you look at new drugs and you look at a lot of these drugs that target unmet medical needs, what we're seeing is that when a drug gets approved for a narrow indication for the treatment of a rare cancer, the follow-on innovation, the ability of another innovator to come into that same category with a second drug is taking longer and longer and longer. So you see drugs come to market and have monopolies for longer periods of time. We now have data showing that. We've looked at that question. So what I want to do also on the new drug side is make it more efficient for a second developer to try to develop a drug similar to a drug that gets approved. So you could have competition on the new drug side as well.